just to start, I want to tell you that we're really welcoming you to the fourth in our series of webinars, exploring how you can reawaken your better nature and improve your life and that of the world that you live in. Not much to do, a lot of hope out there though, and it's great to have you here. I'm Jane Moat. I was a senior journalist at the BBC, and I'm hugely motivated about the possibilities for changing our human story for the better. And I'm going to be doing my best to keep things on track today, but obviously I definitely can't do it without Viv.
Hello everybody, my name is Viviane Ducy, and yes, I try and communicate with most of you in the background. So thank you very much for joining quite early so we can get ourselves sorted by a prompt start at 7 o'clock. Please have your questions ready in the chat if you want, and keep the discussion going throughout the session. That'd be really nice, and then we can catch the questions at the end mostly, but also some of them can be addressed during the time. So very welcome to everybody. Thanks very much for joining.
Thanks, Viv, and thanks again to all of those who've been with us on this journey so far, right from the start, but also lots of people joining us for the first time tonight. Interested, I'm sure, in knowing how you can make a difference by looking to your better nature. Now, this series is led by Tony Whitbread and Paul Hannam, and they're both champions for changing the human story, and they've been generous in telling us their personal stories. Tony is an ecologist who was CEO of Sussex Wildlife Trust for 12 years, and he's now their president. And Tony, last week, you were talking about the need to stop consumers becoming, to stop us being consumers, and that saying that we should become citizens or contributors. So I wondered, could you give us an example of how you've been a contributor?
Have I been a contributor in the last week? Well, let me think. I certainly wouldn't hold myself up as a shining example. That's not really what I'm here to do. But yes, well, we've produced massive excess in courgettes over the last week. So I've been putting them outside, and they've been gobbled up by the population of Storrington. So that's my small way of contributing at the moment. Well,
I wish I'd been out and about in your neck of the woods. I could have done with some courgettes. That's great. Paul, now you're a former IT entrepreneur, author, academic, environmentalist. And I was really uplifted last week, Paul, by your talks about the happiness index. And I wondered, alongside your academic work, can you tell us about any other ways that you try to spread a little happiness?
Well, for me, I'm at my absolute happiest walking. You know, I live in the beautiful South Downs behind me, and whenever I go out walking, literally everything slows down. I'm still, I feel the ground beneath me. I feel immersed in nature, and I try and stop and talk to as many people as possible. In the last week, I've been talking to people about the David Attenborough show. A lot of people watched it, and they didn't know what to do. And I think part of all our role, you know, most of the people here tonight are very committed to the environment. It's down to us to go and talk to as many people as possible and tell them about books they can read, coming on webinars like this, to really encourage people to develop this interest.
Thanks for that, Paul. And I thought we were going to get you diving into some forests and bathing amongst the woods, but we'll come on to that story later. So last time we urged you to become contributors and active citizens rather than being consumers. And today we're exploring two starkly different visions for the future. Do we continue on our path towards exploitation, or can we look at how we rebuild a new system of regeneration? And to start with, I'm going to regenerate an idea that we've had a couple of times before, which is to ask some questions of you. So I have a little poll, which I'm going to ask you to contribute to. Let me just call it up here. So if you can see the poll on your screens now, we only want you to do one, answer one of these. So priority. What do you think is the biggest problem facing the world? Only allowed one answer. Is it climate change? Is it poverty? Is it the pandemic? Is it the destruction of nature? Or is it overpopulation? So quite a difficult question, I'm sure, because there's lots of potential answers. It's not as straightforward as some of our quizzes before, or polls before. People are still voting. Thank you for that. So we're asking, what do you think is the biggest problem facing the world? Climate change, poverty, pandemic, destruction of nature, or overpopulation? And we've had 83% of our people online voting, which is a great turnout. Wish we had that in our elections normally. Let's have a look at the results then. So the results are destruction of nature is the highest with, well, no, it's the joint highest with 43%, and climate change with 43%. Poverty in the pandemic, 3 and 2% in order, and overpopulation, 10%. So, Paul, any surprises there?
Well, for me, tonight is all around connecting the dots. I think most of the people here, I would expect that climate change and destruction of nature would have been near the top. But overpopulation, poverty, so many other global issues are all connected. And what we want to do tonight is connect the dots between a lot of problems that the world's facing. Because Tony and I are going to talk about how it's the current system in nature and in human systems that's really causing a lot of the problems. But first of all, I want to do something a little different. And I'd like everybody to take a deep breath. And whatever has happened today, however good or bad it's been, however big or small your worries, I want to take you on a journey to put all of this into context. And I want to imagine that you are from a more advanced civilization, and you've been traveling through the galaxy, maybe for decades, looking for life, looking for signs of life. And as we know, in the known universe, as far as we know, there are no other planets that support life. But eventually you come towards the solar system, and you look out there and you notice a particular planet as you get nearer. And this is a fascinating planet because it's clear that it supports life. It's clear that it has the right combination of elements, of carbon, nitrogen, water, has energy. It has the right tilt and the right gravity to support atmosphere, and it has exactly the right conditions for life. And you are amazed at the beauty of this planet, having been traveling through effectively a lifeless universe for a very long time. And you want to study this planet and really get a feel for its beauty and how magnificent it is. And you notice some fascinating things. You notice the oceans, you notice the land, you notice the skies, and you see there's some extraordinary creatures. And the most extraordinary creature seems to be human beings. Then you think, who are these human beings? What have they done? How fortunate they have been to have this wonderful planet to be alive on. But then you notice other things. You notice that our culture is doing terrible damage to the planet. And because you're a more advanced species, you can see pollution, you can see the effects of climate change. You know this story. You've been through the same maybe on your planet, and you can understand what's happening. But you also see conflict. You see refugee camps, you see troubles. And what we need to understand is that we live on this extraordinary planet, and we've been given this amazing gift of life. And I think the great tragedy is that we've created a system that, yes, has delivered extraordinary benefits to so many people, but right now is in danger of making potentially life unsustainable. May not in our lifetime or our children's lifetime, but going forward into the future. So we simply have to look at a new system. We have to look at a new approach. We need a new story. This has been a theme for all of the talks that we've been giving. Now, has anyone here heard of the Earth Charter? If you could raise your hand if you've ever come across it. Notice a few people. So I discovered the Earth Charter 20 years ago when I was teaching at university. And for me, it's one of the definitive visions and a very powerful, motivating, positive story about how life could be. The Earth Charter was developed by many extraordinary people, including Mikhail Gorbachev, people from the United Nations, academics and scientists over a period of several years, and it was published in 2000. And I want to read you the preamble from the Earth Charter. We stand at a critical moment in Earth's history, a time when humanity must choose its future. As the world becomes increasingly interdependent and fragile, the future at once holds great peril and great promise. To move forward, we must recognize that in the midst of a magnificent diversity of cultures and life forms, we are one human family and one earth community with a common destiny. We must join together to bring forth a sustainable global society founded on respect for nature, universal human rights, economic justice, and a culture of peace. Towards this end, it is imperative that we, the peoples of Earth, declare our responsibility to one another, to the greater community of life, and to future generations. And tonight we want to look at the big picture. We want to see our place in history, and we want to shift from exploiting the Earth to regeneration.
Thanks very much, Paul. That's an amazing scene setter, and I wish that we had that charter emblazoned on our walls wherever we went. We might think very differently with that sort of story behind us. And Tony, I wondered if I could just ask you, the part of the Earth Charter is about respecting nature and not exploiting it. And what do you think that means in practice?
Yes, bringing it down to practice, because that thing about respecting nature, which is clearly something we don't do. I mean, what does that actually mean, and what does a difference mean? What would a change look like? Yes, at the moment, our current human story, the thing we tell ourselves, is that we're here to exploit nature. It's just a thing. It's an infinite thing, and it's just there for us to exploit, for us to trade, for us to just make use of. But it's a bit like having a bank account and you're running down the capital rather than the interest. If this in a finance situation, it would be silly to just continually run down your capital and then be surprised when it's all gone. And yet, actually, that's what we're doing with natural capital. We're running down the capital account. We're not living off the interest. And yet, if you try to reverse that, we're kind of pitched as an idealist. We need something different. We need a change. Instead of using up nature, we need a new story, which is actually about cherishing it and regenerating it. Now, we've talked about this for a while. I just dropped those words into the conversation, and they are critical words. But I want to do is just kind of skate over a few thoughts about what that actually looks like. What would it look like to have a culture where we're actually regenerating nature rather than just exploiting it? Well, it's fine, because actually this has been known for a very long time. This is not new stuff. There's been many people for generation after generation who actually have the kind of words to describe how we should be regenerating nature. I couldn't think back, well, I can't think back because I wasn't there, but the person who set up the Wildlife Trust movement was Charles Rothschild in 1912. And the language is different, but he was basically saying the same thing. His language was about the preservation of nature. But preservation he meant the same thing as conservation. He meant the same thing about looking after the whole system. So certainly, all back through history, people knew what to do when it comes to regenerating nature. But let's think about some words of the time today. Can I actually boil this down to some phrases that we can actually grasp and make use of today? And for 10, 20 years now, it's been boiled down to just 4 words: better, bigger, more, and joined. Well, we need wildlife sites. We need nature which is in a better condition. It needs to be bigger. There needs to be a lot more of it. And it needs to be more places where you find nature. And also it needs to be all joined up and interconnected. It can't be isolated. Now, to kind of paint a picture of what I mean by that, I just have an imaginary journey, really. If you stand on the top of the South Downs in Sussex, or maybe one of the other sites that you actually know, some of the places you know, but in Sussex it's really illustrative. Stand on the South Downs, look to the north over the Weald of Sussex. Fantastic view, assuming the weather's nice. And you can look out over this landscape, which actually is one of the most interconnected landscapes in lowland England. So it looks great from some positions. It looks like a continual forest. But if you look a little bit closer, nature is limited to very small sites. It's often degrading in those small sites. Figures that came out this week showed that every river in England fails its quality standards. Now that's a bit of an eye-opener. So a lot of our places are actually degrading, not improving. So you look out and you see this area, which actually, when you look in detail, it's in small sites, they're degrading, there aren't enough of them, and actually they're not connected either. When you look in more detail, you can see even when you've got good wildlife sites, they exist in isolation, they're not joined up, which is a worry. So if you simplify the landscape in the way we're seeing, maybe you're not even losing vast amounts of habitat, but if you simplify that landscape, if you simplify the way that wildlife sites work together, then wildlife inevitably reduces. It inevitably simplifies, it will inevitably disappear, and then ecosystems start to function less well. And that's the key thing. So currently, wildlife is restricted to a small number of small sites that are in poor condition and are not joined up. So it's not rocket science to want to reverse this. And there's been all sorts of strategies over the last few years to try and think about how we do that. Now, what I want to do now is actually give an example of how that might work in practice with a specific place. Now, I'm a woodland ecologist, so I nearly always point to woodlands and forests, but I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I'm going to point to a different sort of example. I'm going to talk about, well, a forest, but a kelp forest in the sea, so kelp forests. You think about kelp, you think about marine kelp, it's a sort of very large seaweed. Think about kelp, you might think, oh, maybe off the Galapagos Island or maybe in the Great Barrier Reef. No, Worthing. This is where I'm talking about. I'm talking about Worthing. And then up until the 1980s, we had quite an extensive kelp forest off Worthing. Since the 1980s and now, it's been reduced like crazy to very small pockets. It's been destroyed largely by fishing practices. So the Sussex Wildlife Trust has started a project called Help Our Kelp, and the whole idea is to restore, to regenerate this habitat. Great. Now it's not, yes, it is being done because of its biodiversity interest, its wildlife interest, but what actually happens if you actually regenerate that ecosystem? Well, first of all, the way to do it is simply to stop damaging it. So it's actually not that difficult, and we know what to do. Stop damaging it. Cause of damage, fishing practices. Reduce the fishing practices. Now, I'll come back to that in a little while. So what happens when you reduce those fishing practices? Well, it's hoped, and it hasn't started yet, but it's hoped that it will simply naturally regenerate itself. Nature can be very vibrant, marine ecosystems particularly vibrant, so it will probably regenerate itself. What happens if it regenerates itself? What sort of benefit is that? Well, the benefits are huge. Kelp grows far faster than on-land terrestrial ecosystems. It locks up carbon far faster than forests, far faster. I think I've seen some figures saying 40 times as fast. It locks that carbon up and pumps it down to the deep in the ocean. So it's reducing carbon from the atmosphere. It actually may have an effect in terms of reducing the impact of waves on the coast. So it has an erosion prevention function as well. It probably does something when it comes to the way sediments move across the coast. Talking about fishing, we've restricted the fishing practices, but actually what we're finding with these sorts of regeneration practices, once you've done that, you catch far more fish around the edge of this zone than you ever did from the middle of it when it was destroyed. So fishing will go up. So all these things happen. And I think it makes several points there. It's a very positive thing. You can actually regenerate nature or encourage it to regenerate itself, and then you get massive benefits as a result. So this whole thing about the regeneration of nature is very, very possible, very, very, very likely if you actually give nature the chance. Essentially, what we need to do is give space for nature and time for nature so it can regenerate itself, maybe with a lot of help from us, but certainly it can regenerate, and then it can continue to function. And if it continues to function, it can carry on providing all the benefits that we actually completely rely on.
Fantastic. So we're supporting kelp, and we're seeing how regenerating nature can support ourselves as well. And Paul, how do these concepts of exploitation and regeneration apply to human systems?
Well, Tony's been talking about natural systems, but the problems we're facing, the challenge is not just the way we're treating nature, but it's the human systems that we've created over the last few hundred years, particularly since the Industrial Revolution. And, you know, we want to be very positive tonight, but we do need to understand, you know, the gravity of what's happening. You know, we are facing problems, serious problems, and the cause is a global system that is just not working anymore. There was a fascinating statistic that came out last week. Some of you might have seen it in the news from an Oxfam report that basically said the world's richest 1% cause double the CO2 emissions of the poorest 50% of the world. And in a nutshell, that sums up just how toxic this system is. And I want you to go back to that first shot I showed you of approaching our planet and looking at it from the view of advanced life form. How could this have happened? How could we have allowed this to have happened? How did these systems create? Well, I don't want to go through the history, but it's more important tonight that we look at the principles for moving from exploitation to regeneration. But our current capitalist system is highly exploitative, it's inequitable, it's built around the needs of corporations, lobbyists, the media. It's about absentee profit maximization. It's something chronically wrong. And I think if you look at what's happened during COVID-19, it's really highlighted these structural problems and I think dysfunctions. Is that the share prices in Dow Jones, FTSE and around the world have gone up. Some places hit highs. Yet at the same time, we're seeing record unemployment, record closure of businesses, and a lot of people are talking about a massive amount of poverty that's going to be happening in Africa and other developing countries. The knock-on effects are going to be going on for years as a result of this, and we're only just seeing the beginning. So there's something clearly wrong. And what we need to do is think of, if we were that higher life form looking at our planet, knowing there's nearly 8 billion people here with very limited resources, what would we do? And I think there's certain principles, and I want to come back again to the Earth Charter because I think it really summarized some of the key principles. And the first of these is to have respect and care for the community of life, that every animal, every ecosystem, every person has value. Very, very important concept, rather than it being built around people who have power or have the most money. The second is maintaining ecological integrity, which we've talked a lot about in the webinars, the need to prevent climate collapse and ecological collapse. But we have to put the ecology first, because when you look at the world from that perspective of outside, what is more important, and we saw this in the initial poll, than stabilizing our climate? Our climate's been stable for thousands of years. It gave us the benefit of agriculture. We are so fortunate to have this, yet we're ruining it in just a few generations. So we need to put that first. But we also have to consider social and economic justice. I don't believe that we can use our current economic model as an example to lift everybody out of poverty, because as we said in the last webinar, it would be impossible for everybody to consume at the same level as the average English person or American. And finally, we have to address problems of democracy, non-violence and peace. All of these four are connected. So when we look at a new system, we're not just looking at renewable energy, we're not just looking at conservation, because all of these different elements are connected and have an impact. War is one of the most ecologically destructive things that can possibly happen. I remember giving a lecture 20 years ago, when I was teaching at Oxford, and said that the biggest cause of wars in the 21st century would not be about oil, as they'd largely been in the previous century, but would be about water rights. And I think we're already seeing in the Middle East, we're seeing in Africa, we're seeing in other parts of the world, real struggles as drought is increasing. So we have to think geopolitically. We can't ignore politics. We can't ignore inequity in the world. We have to address these things. And I think there's some other very important principles. Most of us were taught at school to think in a very linear way, but we have to think systemically. We have to look at the interdependence between parts. Incremental change is not enough, and I'm going to come on to this in more detail later. We have to build our new system on cooperation, not competition. Resilience and adaptability have to be at the heart of a healthy system. We need to plan for the long term. The problem is our political systems are all geared up for short-term election cycles. And yes, we need elections, yes, we need a democracy, but we need to think about the long term. And we need to build, I think above all, build the new system on the well-being of all, not the wealth of a few.
Wow. Thanks very much, Paul, for that. We're getting some great comments in the chat, and we will come to questions much later because there is a lot to get through, but I'm really enjoying hearing the responses there, so please keep those coming. And some of what you were saying just made me feel like I was back in the United Nations with everyone having an equal value, and that's a really important principle there. Tony, when you look at how this might impact on nature, can you talk about the sorts of actions that we need to take, the mindset that we need to be in to regenerate nature?
No, we assume that all interactions from humans are inevitably negative. You know, whether we do anything, it's bound to have some effect. All you can do is limit your effect, your impacts. So, you know, we inevitably exploit, we inevitably damage by whatever we do. Now, I want to challenge that, because this is very much the old human story, the old kind of assumption, really, and it's certainly not inevitable. There are many, many cases, either specific cases and large cases, of completely the reverse. Regenerative interactions. You know, throughout history, our 300, 200,000 year history, many human actions are regenerative, work with nature, but also here and now in Sussex and worldwide. There are plenty of examples that buck this trend of destructive exploitation. So it's not, you know, that we're talking about in idealistic terms. These things exist. So what I was trying to do is just think, well, what do I mean by regeneration? What are some of the kind of principles, you know, just at a superficial level, if we think about that? Well, think about the Earth's great cycles that we're trying to maintain and enhance. That gives us a clue of the sorts of properties that a regenerative system would have. Systems that maintain and enhance nutrient cycles. If they maintain and enhance nutrient cycles, then the need for inputs would be very low and the outputs would be low as well. Things that regenerate and build soils. Soils are so important. They're at the base of everything we need. There's a reason why the organic group in this country is called the Soil Association, because of the importance of the soils. They are the engine of nutrition. They lock up carbon. You know, everything relies on the soils working. And assist, you know, systems that regenerate and enhance hydrology as well. Things linked to hydrology like flooding, erosion, accretion, water resources, amelioration of pollution. So a regenerating system would regenerate hydrology. In a regenerating system, pollinators would be working well. There would be bees. We would have lots of pollination. It's very worrying the way that pollinators are falling off a cliff at the moment. And animals are actually part of natural systems and would be part of regenerating systems as well. I'll come back to this in a little while. And also a regenerating system would maintain and enhance biodiversity, wildlife. It's not a balance. If you've actually got a system which is doing well for humans, it doesn't mean you have to balance the loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity is more than just a component, it's actually a driver of the system. So animals, plants, they actually are not just sitting there, they're doing something. They're part of the system, driving the whole system itself. And they're a proxy measure of how you're getting on. So giving a couple of examples of what I mean by this. I think it was last time or the time before, I talked about rewilding. I talked about rewilding from the perspective of it being an expression of our place in nature, an expression of our relationship with nature. The idea that we're part of nature, not separate from it, that's well expressed by rewilding, because there you have the system. But today I want to talk about it in terms of a mechanism for regeneration. If you actually rewild an area, what you're doing is actually putting natural processes back in place, rebuilding those natural processes, rebuilding nature so it can function for itself. And in doing so, that regenerates biodiversity, regenerates the soils, regenerates hydrology, brings back the pollinators, brings back all these things. And we know this is true. We've got one of the best examples in the country, in the Nepa state in central West Sussex. And one example from there, if we think about soils, they've been well monitored, and in just about 15 years, the soils are recovering at a massive rate. These sorts of things are supposed to take centuries. We're seeing it happen in just 15 years. Twice as much carbon, there's twice as much carbon in the soils than there was 15 years ago. The soil carbon has massively increased. The structure of the soil is massively improved. The biodiversity content of the soil is massively improved. All this has happened really, really quickly. Now, traditional conservation looks after what's already there. This is what we've often done over decades, really. We've always tried to do more. We've always tried to rebuild, but we kind of sometimes get put into the box of trying to reduce the decline. Now, actually, rewilding is one example. It's not the only example, but it's one example of how we're looking further than that, bigger than that. We're looking at rebuilding the natural processes, getting some of those functions working again, and then things start to happen. So that's rewilding at one end of the spectrum. Another example, again, I want to skate over, is the idea of regenerative agriculture. And again, there are loads of different sorts of systems that fit within this category. You can think of biodynamics, you can think of permaculture, forest food gardens, all those sorts of things. But there are actually quite a few traditional, modern, intensive, chemically led farms where they're actually applying some of the ideas of regenerative agriculture as well. So there's all sorts of different examples. So there's many approaches. And what I'd recommend actually is a book by Mark Shepard, which I think we'll put in the chat line, called Restoration Agriculture. It's actually an American book, but it gives you a good understanding of what we kind of mean by regenerative agriculture. And I'll pick out a few kind of indicators of what regenerative agriculture actually looks like. It's probably going to be multi-layered. Think about natural systems. They're not monocultures. They're probably going to be multi-layered, layers of vegetation. They're probably going to involve multiple species, not just one monocrop, but several species grown together, or at least very, very close. There's a tendency towards perennial crops rather than annual crops. Annual crops can be quite destructive of soils if not done in a very good way. Perennial crops, nuts, berries, fruits, and so on. There's a great tendency towards no-dig or very low-till approaches. So you're not disturbing the soil. Disturb the soil, you're disturbing the soil biodiversity, and you're also releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And these systems tend to be very low input. They can be very low input because the natural cycling of the nutrients is working for itself. It doesn't need inputs. Now I want to move on, before I finish this bit here, is to move on to something which is actually a little bit controversial. I'm interested to wait to see what people think. That is, animals are a part of natural systems, and so they're often part of regenerative agricultural systems. At one end of the spectrum, producing meat, having meat, using land to produce meat for human consumption is actually quite a barking mad idea, because actually it involves at least a 90% inefficiency. You need 10 times as much land to grow food from meat than if you grew it to produce plants. So it's a massive inefficiency. And if you want to read more about the problems of meat on the massive scale globally, then I would direct you to Philip Limbury, who's the chief executive of Compassion in World Farming, and his excellent book, Farmageddon. So he'll give you a really good systemic explanation of the problems with meat. On the other hand, I'll direct you to another book by a guy called Graham Harvey called The Carbon Fields. What he explains there is the value of animals as part of systems. You have animals as part of regenerative agriculture, they actually have a very strong function. It's probably easier to do sustainable regenerative agriculture with animals in the system than if they're not there at all. So therefore you'll get surplus animals, so therefore you've got meat. So how do you reconcile those two opposites? Producing meat, using land to produce meat, is a bit of a barking mad idea, very inefficient. But actually you need them as part of regenerative systems. And the way I bring that together is actually, meat is actually a byproduct of regenerative agricultural systems. You don't actually have the first priority of producing meat, but it's actually the byproduct of things when they're working properly.
So really, you're talking about quite an idealistic world of diverse use of land to produce a good range of product, whether it's meat or otherwise. But that diversity, you're talking about low input, doesn't that mean low output as well? And therefore, many people would say, well, you're not going to feed the world like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common criticism that it's okay to have these idealistic systems. You dress up as Bo Peep and go and pet the animals, but in the meantime, we need to actually feed the world. Well, actually, we can face that one head on. Modern agriculture doesn't feed the world, and starvation is very rarely because there's a lack of food. Starvation is usually because of poverty or wars or distribution or waste problems. So actually, and modern agriculture doesn't feed the world. We have those problems now, but we have enough food in the world to feed quite a lot more than our current population. So modern agriculture doesn't feed the world. More importantly, it doesn't nourish the world. We're producing vast amounts of cheap food, but actually some of our nutritional properties are going right down. So again, I'll point you back to Mark Shepard's book, just because it happens to be one I've recently read. And he brings out an excellent example of maize, a maize crop, which is one of the most productive crops that you can have using modern traditional systems. But it mines the soil. It's one of the crops, certainly in Britain, which is causing most of the erosion. So it mines the soil. It mines the regenerative properties of the ecosystem that it's in. So it destroys those regenerative properties to produce the maize. And it takes vast amounts of inputs and control and management. Now, if you compare that to restoration agriculture, actually restoration agriculture produces twice the usable calories. With maize, a lot of that crop goes to feeding animals, and then you have this 90% inefficiency. A lot of the rest goes into industrial processes. The amount that's actually fed to humans is actually a tiny proportion. Meanwhile, restoration agriculture produces twice the amount of usable calories. And it's a set of more nutritional crops, all grown on the same place. So you get more nutritional crops grown on the same place, whilst it's growing soils rather than reducing soils, whilst it's actually regenerating biodiversity, it's fixing hydrology, it's locking up carbon, and all for virtually no external inputs. So all this is being done by regenerative farming. I'll move on from that. You're thinking about this a little bit more. You can actually support regenerative agriculture in all sorts of different ways. And this, in my mind, is where we're going to have to move into the future. How do you support regenerative agriculture? Well, you can do it in your own garden. I think a lot of people are turning to no-dig approaches, regenerating their soils, maybe mixing in with multi-crop approaches in your garden, in your allotments, in your community projects, in your community orchards, in your food networks, all those sorts of things. But actually, you can also support local products that are grown in this way. If we actually add to the pressure to grow these sorts of products locally, as Philip Limbury says, you can actually influence agriculture 3 times a day with every meal that you eat. So you can use that buying power. And it gets you a stake in the local area. You have a stake in how stuff is grown if you're actually supporting your local growers. Now, this is really positive. This is all positively part of a new human story. It is our better nature in both senses of the phrase. So actually, it's long-term sustainable products. It nourishes the world. It brings communities together, because a lot of these are community actions, and it restores biodiversity and enables ecosystems to recover. So I really don't know why we're not doing this already, but it must fit within a regenerative economic system that supports it, which we haven't got at the moment. Our economic system supports exploitation rather than regeneration. So we need a different economic system. And, well, what could that sort of system look like?
Well, maybe Paul can answer a bit of that question. We've got some great answers in the chat as well, some really good suggestions there, which we're going to come to shortly. But in terms of the systems that we have, Paul, are there good examples of how we can apply this regeneration to our economy and society? Because we have to be holistic if any of this is going to work.
Very much so. Unfortunately, there are a lot of initiatives that are taking place at the moment. But I want to structure those initiatives into 2 types. And the first type I want to look at is what I will call improving or reforming the current system. That is taking, broadly speaking, the current model of capitalism in its many different forms and changing it from within. And I want to go through a few initiatives, and then we'll come to the second one, which is changing the system itself. Now, some of you would have heard this phrase, the Green New Deal. And in 5 weeks' time, we're going to have one of them, as I've said before, one of the most important elections in our lifetime in the United States, not just affecting the US, but everywhere in the world. And the cornerstone of Joe Biden, for the first time ever in any main candidate, he's promoting a very green agenda, and he's calling it the Green New Deal, and he's working with other Democrats. And the idea of the Green New Deal, well, actually, it's being fundamentally motivated by the need to create jobs. So the idea is there's massive job losses in America. I think at 1.30 million people lost their job in March. And so the idea is, to, just like FDR did, Franklin Roosevelt did in the 1930s, is to help people find jobs through great public initiatives and works. And these works will be transforming the energy infrastructure to renewables. It will be retrofitting every home and business in America, every building. It will be transforming the transport system and also dealing with pollution. We're talking about potentially trillions of dollars, so there is a huge amount at stake in the US. Now, we've heard murmurings of green recovery in the UK. I don't think we've seen nearly enough. I would have hoped that COVID would have been a much more positive response in terms of green recovery, but Caroline Lucas, other people in the Labour Party have been promoting it, and it's something worth keeping an eye on. So this could be a win-win in the short term of creating jobs, helping to alleviate recession or depression, and also doing something very positive for the climate. But there are certain other things we need to do desperately within the system, and one of the most important things, which a lot of people have been advocating for a while, is to end fossil fuel subsidies. It is quite insane, but decades after we've known about the dangers of fossil fuels, that fossil fuel companies are still getting between 500 billion and $1 trillion of subsidies every year. where renewable energy gets a fraction of that. It's insane, absolutely insane. And it attests to the lobbying power of fossil fuels and the power of a system which we've been talking about. Now, if you factor in externalities, the real cost of fossil fuels, the figure is dramatically higher. And the great tragedy is that, yes, China's doing great things, and Japan and other countries, but they are still, in China, Japan, and India, they are still planning to build over 100 major new coal plants in this year. So 1 step forward, 3 steps back, and we have to end investment in fossil fuels. We have to all put pressure on banks and on funds to disinvest. This is a big movement around the world of disinvesting in dirty fossil fuel investments. We clearly need a massive investment in renewables, in wind farm, in solar. But I think we also need a carbon tax. We need a climate income. And however we redistribute that tax, we really do need to tax carbon because it is causing so much damage, carbon emissions. So that's a number of changes that we can bring about within the current system, and clearly technological innovation is another one. But Tony and I, and a large group of other people, believe that we actually need to go beyond that. That just reforming the system is going to be insufficient. We need to transition to a new system. And we need to make massive reductions in carbon by 2030. We need 50% cut, basically, in order to hit the target set by the IPCC. And that means changing our energy infrastructure, changing the way we live, the way we do business, the way we work, the way we travel, a fundamental change. And we've talked a lot about the psychology, the cultural issues around that, but there's some profound economic changes that we need to make. And it's important that we build this new system, coming back to looking at the planet, looking at one species, on one nation, one world, one species, and we think about it from that way. And there's a term you might also have heard, which is very popular at the moment. Yesterday, Prince Charles talked about a Marshall Plan for the environment, which is, if you like, in the old model. But there's another analogy from the Second World War, which is mobilization. And there are a large number of people who believe that we have to mobilize everyone in society, far more than we've done for fighting coronavirus, that every person, every community has to come together and work to really change the system. Now, that's not necessarily going to happen, but we need to think in those terms. And I'd just like to show a few slides about some very specific economic models which we can be looking at. So the first idea is to look at how we've been working up to now. Basically, everything has been along what we call a linear economy. We extract, we make, we use, we dispose, we pollute, and we produce carbon emissions. We waste a huge amount of energy through the whole process. That, since the Industrial Revolution, in a nutshell, in very simple economics, has been how we've gone about. But there's a new approach, if we can see the next slide. And this is the concept of the circular economy. That's a very big idea, but basically we have to imitate nature. This is sometimes called biomimicry, but we have to imitate the natural cycles of nature, because nature barely wastes anything. It makes, it uses, it reuses, it remakes, it recycles, and minimizing waste is absolutely essential. And this brings me in, as I say, we're not just talking about economics. Any system we develop has to take into account what I think are these absolutely essential goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I recommend that you look at them. But we need to build a system that really encourages these things. And you know, a lot of environmentalists would say, you know what they say, the #1 thing we need to do for the environment is to empower and educate women. But that is a huge factor. And again, what we're doing tonight is connecting the dots, because an empowered woman, giving women in developing countries power over birth control and education, will have a huge impact on population, on many other areas. All these areas are critical, we have to deal with. But what this has been done, I'd like to show you another slide to really explain a core concept here. Where I used to work at the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford, I worked there until 2005. Kate Raworth is now working there, and she's for me one of the leading people in the world right now. You know, we all know Greta Thunberg, we know Dave Attenborough people, but what Kate Raworth is doing, she's developed a model called donut economics, which really explains the heart of what's going on. And this is the UN model. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see that if we look at, imagine this is a donut, and I'm just going to quickly go through it. The outer level, the ecological ceiling, is the limit we can't go beyond in terms of ozone layer depletion, climate change, ocean acidification. And then you've got this other green circle inside called social foundation. Those are the needs we've just been looking at, that every citizen of the world has a right to energy, to water, to food, to health, to education, to peace, a political voice, to social equity. And the space in between, which is like the donut, is the safe and just space for humanity. Any new system, any system we develop has to be within that space. It has to provide for the social needs and the well-being of the world's citizens, but it has to stay within and not overshoot the ecological ceiling. And this model, which is called donut economics, is being adapted by quite a few cities around the world, in Berlin, in Amsterdam. It's being taught at community level. She's talking to national leaders, and there's a whole group of scientists and economists working with her, which is very exciting. And linked very closely to this, one of the core ideas is this idea, which I've talked about before, of degrowth. Why is it that economics we must always grow the economy? Why is growth always such a good thing? And another great book to read is Prosperity Without Growth by Tim Jackson, who teaches at Surrey University. And he's really, and there's other economists have been advocating this, that we have to build an economy where people can thrive even if we're not increasing the GDP. And again, what better time than right now with COVID-19 to be thinking about and experimenting with these ideas. I was very interested that in an FT editorial back in, I think, May, they even said that it's worth looking at universal basic income. Now, we've had the furlough scheme. It's not that different. We need to be looking at the most radical ideas right now, because there'll never be a better time. We need to look at, I think, shifting power away from big corporations to cooperatives, from big banks to old-fashioned cooperative savings, from national government to local government. But I think one of the most exciting ideas, and if I was to go 100 or 200 years into the future of our planet, I could foresee a world where we were working in local communities. We had integral, independent local communities who are all connected at a global level. And I think that is one of the most exciting, it's going to be a long way off, but one of the most exciting models of all. But everything is up for grabs now. And I feel that we're never going to have a better opportunity to make this shift from exploiting the earth to regeneration. So let's take it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul, and to Tony, such inspiration, so many ideas. I know everybody's feeling almost overwhelmed by how much information they're getting, and we have said this will be on YouTube afterwards, and also we will be putting information up on Facebook. But there's been just as much information coming from the chat, and I'll summarise a bit of it as we go. But I've just had a question from Clive to Paul. Is there any one thing a government could enact that would really sort things in the short term, even no matter how disruptive?
Well, I think, not just my view, but when I talk to other environmentalists and scientists, the quicker we can move away from fossil fuels, the better. Whatever it takes in terms of ending all subsidies, in terms of going for, net zero carbon society, doing whatever, even if we have to stop the economy almost, to have as fast and rapid a shift as possible. And so I think having a green recovery plan, doing what I was talking about, the Green New Deal. So, but the transition I talked about in terms of changing the system is going to take decades. But in the short term, that Green New Deal, end fossil fuels, disinvest, and at lightning speed. That would be my view.
And there's quite a lot of a trend in the chat is we need a revolution, we need to be on the streets, partly because, as Liz says, how do we do that? How do we get that change with fossil fuels, for example, when the government is so corrupt? And Jerry Lindsay saying, will the kind of economic changes being suggested be achieved without major civil unrest? A sense, I suppose, that people have got to a frustration point, they can't see how to get a breakthrough.
Well, yeah, I mean, sorry to chip in. If we go back 100 years, I suspect we could be in a meeting like this talking, or 110 years, about suffragettes destabilizing society, bringing society to its knees. But if we look back at how society was 120 years ago, the way we treated women, the way we treated people of colour, the way we treated people with learning disabilities, the way we treated children in child labour, we couldn't have imagined we'd make this much progress. We need that much progress again, but in a very narrow time frame. And anything we can do through protests, whatever, to do that is good by me.
Great.
Yeah, can I say something as well? Yeah, can I say something as well? Because actually, the sort of response comes up a lot, and we end up partially through despair, partially through impatience, both of which are really good in this circumstance. You end up looking for big sudden changes. You know, I wouldn't have been in nature conservation for 27 years if I didn't actually have a rose-tinted spectacles on my face sometimes. And actually, yeah, we can see all the bad things, but there are so many good individual cases bucking the trend, and that's the point. And you can see changes that happened in the past, which now take for granted, which you wouldn't have necessarily seen would have happened so quickly. I'll give a silly example. The Forestry Commission until 1985 were the Conifer Commission. They destroyed ancient woodlands to plant conifers. And that's what they did. And they destroyed much of the uplands, again, with conifer planting. In 1985, there was the broadleaves policy, and that's all it was. And everyone thought it'll be totally ignored. Almost overnight, certainly within a year or two, all the closet conservationists suddenly emerged in the Forestry Commission. And today it is a very different organisation. Now, actually, I can scale that up to where we are now. We don't like corporations, perhaps. We don't like governments, perhaps. We don't like all these different people. But actually, these are made of people. And a lot of these people are really good in there. So actually, you can get a head of steam building up, which is unseen for a long time, and then can get a sudden change at the end of it.
I'm enjoying your optimism this evening. This is great. But a little bit of concern to bring that back down from Jill Sutcliffe, that we need a clear, focused attempt at the green recovery. And she's noted that COP26 group, which has been sent by the government, contains no women. So back to Paul, your issue about, where are women in this recovery, and where's the role of women in this?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think we've talked about this before, that we're connecting dots tonight, and one of the dots is diversity in climate change, and environmental groups have to be far more diverse. But the book that got me involved in environmental movement, even before, it was Tom Hartman's a big book, but I also read at the same time Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It's if you haven't read it, one of the greatest books ever written, and extraordinary. And there have been so many important women in the history of the environmental movement. And yes, we absolutely have to, but not just women, we have to have people of colour, we have to have so many different voices in the environmental movement, because this isn't just about saving the planet, it's about saving our families, it's about saving future generations. Everything is connected here.
Well, just pick up from one woman who's out there doing the walk and not just the talk, as Nicola Peel, and she's just come back from Ecuador, where things are very different, and the risks in the forest there are very, very imminent. But she's also saying the trouble is that worldwide about 42% of cars sold last year were SUVs. The increase in these guzzling cars. We need to change the image of them. How do we change society's aspirations? We talked about this last time, didn't we, about this consumer approach, and what can we do, Paul, with that sort of imagery issue?
Well, it's a good question. It comes back to what we were talking about last week, is understanding why we want these things. And, but from my perspective, we need to get as many celebrities, influencers, media, everybody advocating a green lifestyle. And it has become quite popular in certain quarters, and there are people doing it, but it has to be firmly entrenched. But it's all linked to everything else. Until we move away from fossil fuels, until we move away from the system that still has this obscene amount of subsidies, this obscene amount of lobbying and of political backing, all of this is just not going to work. So we have to make it you know, a real stigmatize these behaviors. That's for me the key. So it makes it psychologically unhealthy and unsatisfying to do this.
And Anne Stewart from the Wheeled Action Group is on tonight as well, and they're bringing out a report soon to just show the nonsense that there is with exploiting onshore oil under the Weald here in the Sussex and Surrey countryside. So we'll be looking out for that one too. Andrew Schoon came up with a point which he might need to explain better than I can, but let me just try this out on you, Tony. Can fossil fuels or carbon fuels not be in balance with regenerative soils, etc.? Their chemistry is simpler and based more on more natural systems. He's worrying about solar, especially with regards to minerals and resource mining.
Yes, an interesting question. And I think, well, fossil fuels involve actually burning off carbon that's been locked up for a very long time. So, and maybe if you'd have asked that question 50 years ago, there would have been something in it. But one thing that we need to bear in mind from the IPCC report, which actually says that we need to keep below 1.5 centigrade, they said it's possible, but built into that possibility is the presumption that we're going to be having technologies to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's not just reducing emissions, it's actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So we have not got the flexibility now to think about balancing a carbon emitting source with a carbon soaking up source. We need both. We need to reduce the amount of emissions massively, but we also need to use every possible method we have for taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Now that's the soils. That's where carbon sequestration happens. It's by building the soils up. But you can't play one against the other. We have to have both. We've left it too long.
That's fine. If I could add something there, for those of you who are interested in the bigger picture, I'd recommend you investigate a concept that I used to teach, and it's really important. It's the difference between what we call shallow ecology and deep ecology. And we need to work at both levels. Shallow ecology is looking for technological solutions. It's looking at reforming the system, as I was talking about. Deep ecology is looking at transition. It's looking at living in harmony with nature. It's looking at putting nature first in everything we do and really mimicking nature. And I think we need to work on both fronts, basically, rather than look at, you know, it is a spectrum to some extent, but we need to work on both fronts to really make it.
Thank you for that. There, we're going to call it, bring it to a close. We've got a few things we want to tell you about before we finish, and we'll then give you a little taster about what's going to be happening in our final webinar next week. So just a reminder from that Earth Charter, I'll certainly be looking that up myself, which is to move forward, we must recognise that in the midst of a magnificent diversity of cultures and life forms, we are one human family and one Earth community with a common destiny. And the language change that we've been talking about tonight is away from growth and exploitation towards cherishing, flourishing, regenerating. One of the many books that has been recommended, but probably the one that I think Tony and Paul were very, very keen for you to look at, is the Kate Raworth Donut Economics. And the story of stuff is always a very, very good watch. And we'll be giving you that link later too. And then just to look at what's happening next week, I can't believe it's our final one. And some people are asking us to keep going. And we're certainly not going to stop with our series. There's plenty more to come from us. But in this series, we're going to refresh and look at that, our new human story. What have we created as a new human story in next week's webinar? You can obviously watch this again on YouTube, and any ones that you may have missed or you want other people to have a look, and we'll try and put some of the information up on Facebook as well, and those are Paul and Tony's Twitter handles. But just before we go, if we can come back in vision, I just wanted a couple of words from Paul and then Tony, because Paul has already been on our radio on the BBC this week on PM, talking about a book and a film that he knows a lot about. But you're back on our airwaves again on Saturday, and I think it feels a bit like Groundhog Day, Paul. What are you going to be talking about?
Well, one of my great passions is the movie Groundhog Day, and I've used it when I've been teaching psychology and about organisational personal change, but also I used to use it in my lectures about the environment, because I think we're actually stuck in Groundhog Day. We're locked into these repetitive habits and systems. So yesterday I was on with Evan Davis interviewed me because it was Bill Murray's 70th birthday, and I talked about Groundhog Day being the ultimate lockdown movie. And I'm doing a longer spot on BBC World Service on their weekend programme. If you're up early on Saturday morning between 8 and 8:30, I'm one of the 3 guests there, and I'll be talking about Groundhog Day. And I hope to talk about it in terms of systemic change as well, because it's a brilliant metaphor for explaining the human condition.
No, well, we'll definitely be tuning in for that. And Tony, I think Your Better Nature has had its first publication as well.
Yes, that's right. It was really nice because one of our viewers, one of our listeners, actually suggested we got in touch with Sussex Bylines to see, because she thought they might be interested in what we are talking about. And looking at their website, they seem to have very similar sorts of values. They're they're into giving journalists, volunteer journalists, a good voice. And so they asked us to produce a short article, which Viv produced on our behalf, and that has been published today. And it's actually advertising our next video as well, our next webinar as well.
So lots of things to look at, lots of things to look forward to. And next week will not be the end of Your Better Nature, it's just the start. But you've been amazing tonight. There's so much rich conversation around the issues that Paul and Tony have raised with us. And thank you for your contributions, and thank you for keeping listening and following us. And we can't wait to see what actions you take as a result of things that you've discussed with us or heard in this forum and others. But for now, that's it from us tonight. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Paul.
Brilliant.
Brilliant.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all your comments. Good stuff.